I'm Lauren Hayes, 35, a graphic designer from Kansas City. On the night of my parents' wedding, the chandeliers sparkled, the champagne flowed, and I thought it was a celebration of love and family. But then my sister took the microphone. In front of everyone, she smiled and announced that I didn't belong with them anymore. The laughter that followed cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. My parents stayed silent. My brother looked away, and in that moment, I realized I had no one in that room. I stood up, left behind an $8,000 bill they expected me to cover, and walked out into the night. That was when the phone calls started. Anger, guilt, demands. But those calls were only the beginning. Because what I uncovered afterward, a secret they thought I would never find out, turned the entire family upside down. Do you believe loyalty has limits even when it comes to blood? Stay with me, because this story will test how far betrayal and karma can reach. I sat near the end of one of the long tables, my dress, a simple navy blue I had bought on clearance. I felt like a stranger in a room full of relatives. My mother Patricia glowed in ivory lace, her hair perfectly set, her hand tucked in my father Richard's as they greeted guests like royalty. My brother Eric sat close to the front with his wife Claire and their two children, both dressed in pressed shirts that I knew had cost more than I made in a week. Megan, my older sister, was everywhere, floating from table to table with that commanding smile of hers, making sure she was the star of the night. I sipped my water and stared at the gold centerpieces, fighting the familiar weight pressing against my chest. For weeks I had heard hints that I would be the one to cover this entire event. Megan had even joked at dinner one evening that I should bring a thick wallet. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe this night would be different. Maybe for once they would let me just be a daughter, not a bank account. The music softened and Megan walked onto the stage where the DJ's microphone waited. She tapped it twice and the chatter faded. Her smile stretched wide and everyone looked up expecting a toast. Even I thought for one tiny moment that maybe she would finally say something kind, something about family, something about me. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking on mine across the room. Her voice rang clear in the microphone. She doesn't belong with us anymore. For a second, silence. Then the room stirred like a hive kicked open. Gasps, whispers, a few muffled laughs. My mother's lips twitched into a small smile, awkward but not surprised. My father's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Eric lowered his eyes to the white tablecloth as if studying the folds could make him invisible. No one rose to defend me. Not a cousin, not an aunt, not even my brother. I felt heat spread up my neck, a flush of humiliation that threatened to break me open. My heart pounded, my palms went damp against the fabric of my dress. I could have screamed. I could have hurled my glass across the table. I could have demanded to know why. But I saw their faces, expectant, waiting for me to crack, to give them another story to tell. I pushed back my chair slowly, the scrape against the floor cutting through the buzz of whispers. I rose to my feet, my hands steady, even though my chest burned. I looked at Megan, her smug face tilted toward me like she had already won. I looked at my mother, glowing and proud in her lace, and my father, rigid as stone. I looked at my brother, still staring down, unwilling to meet my eyes. My lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. Then dinner is not on me either. The words fell into the microphone's lingering echo, sharp and final. I gathered my clutch, slid my chair neatly under the table, and walked toward the exit. My heels clicked against the polished wood floor, each step measured, each step louder in my own ears than the violin playing faintly in the background. I did not turn around. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing tears. The murmurs swelled behind me, a wave of voices rippling through the hall. Someone coughed, another laughed too loudly. The band began to play again, awkward, like they were trying to cover up a mistake. When I reached the heavy doors of the reception hall, I pressed my hand against the brass handle and pushed it open. The cool night air spilled into my lungs, washing over the heat that had choked me moments earlier. I stepped outside, the faint hum of the city greeting me. Behind those doors was the family that had just erased me in front of 100 people. Ahead was the dark parking lot and the steady beat of my own footsteps carrying me away from a room I should never have expected to belong to. The cool air clung to my skin as I walked across the parking lot toward my car. My heels clicked against the pavement, steady and deliberate, though inside my chest my heart still thundered. I slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. For the first time that night, silence wrapped around me, only broken by the faint hum of traffic on the boulevard beyond. My phone buzzed before I could even start the engine. The screen lit up with Megan's name. I let it go to voicemail, but another call came immediately after, and another. I turned the ignition, the headlights cut across the asphalt, and I pulled out of the lot. The phone vibrated again in the cup holder, insistent, angry. I drove through the streets of Kansas City, past the bright glow of the plaza, my reflection fractured in the shop windows. The phone kept buzzing, relentless. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I turned the volume up, let it go to voicemail, and Megan's voice spilled through the speakers, sharp and furious. "You humiliated us in front of everyone. Get back here right now and pay the bill. Do you have any idea what you've done?" My hands tightened around the wheel. I didn't bother replying. The phone buzzed again, this time with my father's name flashing across the screen. I let it go, and his voice followed, low and cold. "This is not how family acts. You owe us this, Lauren. Fix it." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but I kept my eyes fixed on the road. A minute later, another message, my mother this time. Her tone trembled with rehearsed sorrow. "How could you do this to your father on such a special night? Everyone is whispering about us. You broke his heart, Lauren." I pulled up to a red light and let my forehead rest against the steering wheel. The glow from the traffic signal bathed the car in crimson, and for a moment I felt like I was suffocating. My phone buzzed again, one vibration after another piling up like weights on my chest. I finally glanced at the screen. Eric. I almost picked it up, almost gave him a chance to be different. But I let it ring out and waited for his words. "Really, Lauren? You walked out and left us with this. The whole family is embarrassed." The light turned green and I pressed the gas. My eyes stung, but no tears fell. It was not sadness that sat in my chest. It was something else, something heavier but cleaner. A strange mix of hurt and relief. For years, I had carried them, paid their bills, covered their mistakes, swallowed their insults. Tonight, I had finally put it down, if only for one night. My phone kept vibrating, piling up with calls, texts, voicemails. I slid it into the glove compartment and shut it away. The car grew quieter, the road stretched ahead, and the city lights blurred into streaks of gold. By the time I reached Midtown, the streets had quieted. I parked outside my building, the familiar brick facade greeting me like a friend I had ignored for too long. Carrying my clutch, I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When I opened my apartment door, the quiet pressed in thick and heavy. I slipped off my shoes and set them neatly by the door, then stood in the middle of my small living room. The glow from the street lamp filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the worn couch and the stack of sketches piled on my desk. I should have felt alone. Instead, I felt something close to free. The phone buzzed again from the glove compartment downstairs, but this time I did not flinch. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on the couch, and let the events of the night replay in my mind. Megan's voice echoing through the microphone. My mother's smile. My father's silence. Eric's eyes fixed on the tablecloth. 100 witnesses who saw me cut away from them in a single sentence. My chest ached, but it was not the ache of regret. It was the ache of finally tearing off a chain I had carried for too long. I leaned back into the couch and closed my eyes, letting the hum of the city seep in through the thin walls. Tomorrow, there would be more messages, more anger, more guilt. Tonight, there was only the quiet and me, and the knowledge that, for the first time in years, I had walked away. I woke the next morning to the pale light cutting through the blinds, my head heavy but my body strangely calm. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the stack of unopened envelopes on my desk, bills and notices with my name printed in bold. They were reminders of how many times I had stepped in to keep my family's lives afloat, how many years I had been their safety net without ever being asked if I could afford it. In 2016, I remembered sitting in the waiting room of St. Luke's Hospital while my father had his knee surgery. The surgeon came out, spoke of the cost, and my mother's eyes had darted immediately to me. I had nodded before I even thought about it, writing a check for over $10,000. A week later, my mother needed dental implants, another few thousand, and I covered that too. They never said thank you. They only said it was lucky I was single and had extra money. 3 years later, in 2019, my phone buzzed during a late-night project. It was my mother, her voice thin and shaky. She told me they needed me to co-sign a loan for $20,000 to cover medical bills that had stacked up. I told myself it was family, that I was protecting them, that one day they would appreciate it. I drove to the bank in Overland Park, signed the papers, and walked out knowing the debt was tied to my name. I carried that weight every time I checked my credit score, every time I opened my mailbox. Then there was Megan. She had always dreamed of living at the plaza with its boutiques and rooftop views, though her part-time event planner jobs barely paid the rent. Starting in 2018, she called me every month sighing about how she was about to be evicted, and I wired her $800 without fail. Month after month, year after year, until 2021, when I finally realized I had paid nearly $30,000 just to keep her in a lifestyle she flaunted on Instagram as if she had earned it herself. When I asked her once if she might take on a roommate or downsize, she rolled her eyes and told me not to be selfish. And Eric, my brother. He and Claire had chosen Pembroke Hill School for their 2 children, a prestigious private academy where tuition cost $5,000 a semester. His construction business was already collapsing, but instead of facing it, he asked me to step in. I paid semester after semester, telling myself I was doing it for the kids, not for him. I told myself I couldn't let my niece and nephew suffer for their father's mistakes. Yet each time the invoice arrived, it came with silence. No call of gratitude, no note. Only another hint that things were tight and I would come through again. I pressed my palms together, now sitting in my small midtown apartment, and felt a heat in my chest. For 10 years I had been a wallet with legs. I had been told it was my duty because I was unmarried, because I worked freelance, and could work more because I had no children to feed. Every sacrifice was brushed aside as expected. Every check I wrote erased before the ink had even dried. I remembered one night in 2020, hunched over my laptop at 2 in the morning, finishing a branding project just to make rent and send Megan her $800. My head had throbbed, my eyes had burned, but I had kept going. The next day, she posted a photo of herself at a rooftop party, a glass of champagne, raised the caption bragging about independence. My stomach had turned, but I stayed silent. That silence had been my curse. The clock on my wall ticked louder in the quiet of my apartment. My throat tightened, my jaw clenched. For years I had told myself that keeping them afloat was love, that saying no would mean abandoning them. But standing in that reception hall last night, hearing my sister strip me from the family with one sentence, I saw the truth. Love had nothing to do with it. They wanted what I could give, not who I was. I rose and walked to the window, pulled the blinds open, and let the light flood in. The city outside was waking, cars humming down the streets, people heading to work. I thought about the years I had lost, the late nights, the empty savings account, the way my own dreams had withered while I carried theirs. I felt a rush of anger, but also clarity. I whispered into the empty room, almost daring myself to believe it. I will not be used like this ever again. The words hung in the air, sharper than any promise I had ever made. My chest lifted, the ache loosening. I stood there barefoot on the cold floor and knew that something inside me had shifted for good. 3 days later, the buzzer to my apartment went off like an alarm. I had been sketching at my desk, a cup of cold coffee beside me, when the sharp sound jolted me. I walked to the intercom and pressed the button. The grainy camera flickered, and there they were, all 4 of them, standing in the entryway of my building like a wall of judgment. Megan with her arms crossed and chin raised. Patricia clutching her purse to her chest, eyes already rimmed red. Richard standing stiff, hands jammed in his pockets. Eric shifting from foot to foot, eyes darting anywhere but the camera. I froze for a moment, then I pressed the door release. The metal click echoed in my chest, louder than it should have. Within minutes, their footsteps pounded up the stairwell, and then they were in my living room without waiting for me to invite them. Megan wasted no time. She stepped forward, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You ruined everything. You humiliated us in front of our family and friends. You think walking out of that reception made you strong. It made you pathetic. Patricia's face crumpled and she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. How could you do this to your father on the happiest night of his life? Everyone was staring at us whispering. My heart broke watching him stand there, and you just left. Richard stayed silent at first. His eyes swept across my apartment like he was inspecting a hotel room that didn't measure up. Finally, his voice came low and heavy. You will make this right, Lauren. You have always fixed things. Fix this. Eric shifted again, then spoke his words careful but still pointed. Things are already hard, Lauren. The kids need their school. They cannot just leave Pembroke. You know how much we count on you. I stood near the kitchen counter, my arms folded tightly against my chest. My heart hammered, but for once I didn't feel small. I felt steady, grounded. I looked at each of them in turn and my voice came out clearer than I expected. I am not your bank account. Not anymore. Megan scoffed, her laugh sharp. Oh please. You have no husband, no kids, nothing to spend money on. What else are you going to do with it? Stop acting like a martyr. Patricia's sobs grew louder, but I could see the calculation behind her tears. She had played this role too many times for me to believe it anymore. Richard stepped forward, his height casting a shadow across the room. Watch your tone, he said. Family does not abandon family. Something inside me snapped. Family does not laugh when their daughter is told she does not belong. Family does not sit silent when she is humiliated in front of 100 people. Family does not drain her savings and then pretend to be broke while she works herself sick. I was shaking now, but not from fear. From rage that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Eric raised his hands like he wanted to calm me, but his words betrayed him. We all know you can handle it, Lauren. You have always handled it. That is what you do. I laughed, then a sound that surprised me, bitter and hollow. Exactly. I handle everything. I cover the rent, the tuition, the surgeries, the parties, and what do I get in return? Silence. Smirks. Or worse, public humiliation. The room fell quiet. Megan's eyes narrowed, Patricia sniffled, Richard's jaw clenched, Eric looked away. I reached for my phone on the counter, my thumb hovering over the screen. You need to leave, I said. Now. No one moved. Megan's voice dripped with contempt. Or what? I held up the phone, my hand steady. Or I call building security. A silence stretched thick and heavy. Then Patricia gathered her purse, muttering about ungrateful children. Eric mumbled something I could not hear. Richard's glare stayed locked on me as he turned toward the door. Megan lingered a moment longer, her lip curling, her voice low and sharp. You will regret this. Their footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading into the stairwell. I stayed frozen for a moment, the phone still in my hand. My apartment was quiet again, but the air still vibrated with their anger. I set the phone down slowly, pressing my palms to the cool surface of the counter. The room felt different now. Not safe exactly, but claimed. Mine. For the first time in years I had stood my ground and they had been the ones to leave. The next afternoon, Brittany called and asked if I could meet her for coffee. Her voice was quick and nervous, the way it always got when she had something she was dying to spill. I agreed, though part of me wanted nothing more than to stay in bed and forget the world. Crossroads Coffee was busy when I walked in, the smell of roasted beans wrapping around me. Brittany was already there, waving from a corner booth, a half-finished latte in front of her. She looked almost too eager, her eyes wide, and her fingers tapping the rim of her cup. I slid into the booth across from her. What's going on? She leaned in, lowering her voice, even though the cafe was loud. You didn't hear this from me, but I was at a cookout last weekend. You know Uncle Dennis, the one who talks too much when he drinks. He was bragging about a poker night with your dad a while back. Apparently, your dad was showing off that he had a savings account with $52,000 just sitting in it. The words slammed into me harder than I expected. 52,000. The number burned in my ears louder than the hiss of the espresso machine. I blinked at her, my throat dry. Are you sure? Brittany nodded quickly. He laughed about how everyone thought he was broke, said it was fun keeping people guessing. He even mentioned how you always step up and no one ever asks questions. I felt the blood drain from my face. For years they had told me they were broke. For years I had drained my savings to cover their bills, their surgeries, their mortgages, their tuition excuses, and all along there was a cushion, a secret pile of money that they never touched because they had me to lean on. Brittany reached for my hand across the table, her voice soft now. I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but you deserve to know. I pulled my hand back, not unkindly, but because I couldn't bear any touch. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. Images flashed in my mind, nights when I skipped dinners out with coworkers because I had to write a check for Megan's rent. Mornings when I held my breath opening bills, praying I had enough to cover Eric's kids' tuition. And all the while, my father was bragging about hidden savings at a poker table. The betrayal was so sharp it made my eyes sting. I swallowed hard, pressing my palms against my thighs under the table. Brittany hesitated, then added, "There's more." He said something about how no one needed to know, especially you, because you'd never say no if you believed they had nothing. My stomach churned. It was not just about the money. It was the lie, the manipulation, the casual way they had let me bleed myself dry while they laughed behind my back. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, staring at the table as if the grain of wood could anchor me. "So it was all a game to them," I said, finally, my voice flat. Brittany didn't answer. She didn't need to. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of wood on tile cutting through the hum of the cafe. I couldn't sit still any longer. The rage in my chest was too loud, too consuming. I stood, grabbing my coat. Brittany called after me, but I shook my head. Outside, the cold air bit at my cheeks, but it barely registered. My thoughts were racing faster than the cars on Main Street. $52,000. My father's smug laugh. My mother's tears that now felt rehearsed. Megan's sneer. Eric's pleading. They had all been in on it, all complicit in a performance that painted me as the dependable fool. I walked without direction, my boots striking the pavement harder with every step. The betrayal ran deeper than I had admitted even to myself. It wasn't just neglect, it was exploitation dressed up as family loyalty. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaning back against it as it closed. The silence pressed against me, heavy but clarifying. I knew then that the line I had drawn a few nights ago wasn't enough. Refusing to pay their bills was only the start. They had lied to me for years, stolen my peace, stolen my savings, and laughed about it at poker tables. My chest rose and fell as I whispered to the empty room. No more mercy. I walked to my desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad. My pen scratched across the paper, the list forming as quickly as the anger surged. Dates, amounts, every bill, every check, every tuition payment, every rent transfer. $10,000 for the surgery. $20,000 loan I had signed my name to. $5,000 a semester for Eric's kids. $800 a month for Megan's apartment. Years of proof that I had carried them. The list grew longer and longer, the numbers stacking higher until my vision blurred with tears of rage. By the time I dropped the pen, my hand was cramped and my heart was racing. I stared at the messy scrawl, at the years of my life reduced to figures and dollar signs. And then I knew. This was not about asking for thanks or even repayment. This was about exposing the truth. I sat back in the chair, wiping my face with the heel of my hand. My voice came out steady this time, a vow spoken into the still air. I will not be their secret provider anymore. I will be the mirror that shows them exactly who they are. The determination settled in my bones, heavier than the rage, but far more powerful. For the first time, I was not planning how to rescue them. I was planning how to end their game. The next Saturday, I drove east on I-70 toward St. Louis, the winter sky hanging low and gray over the flat Missouri fields. My Aunt Linda had agreed to meet me for lunch, and though my stomach was tied in knots, there was a pull inside me that told me this was necessary. Linda had always been different from the rest of them. She was my mother's younger sister, softer, spoken with eyes that always seemed to catch the details others ignored. Growing up, she was the only adult who asked how I was doing instead of how much I could help. I parked outside a little diner off King's Highway, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and pie displayed under glass. She was already inside, her coat folded neatly on the seat beside her, her hands cupped around a steaming mug. When she saw me, she smiled warmly, though her brow furrowed as I slid into the booth. "You look tired, Lauren." I laughed without humor. Tired feels permanent these days. Her eyes narrowed in concern. "What's going on?" The words tumbled out faster than I expected. I told her about the wedding, about Megan grabbing the microphone, about the humiliation that washed over me as the room turned silent. I described walking out, leaving them all to their own mess. Then I went further, peeling back years of secrets I had carried like lead weights. The loans, the rent payments, the tuition checks, the medical bills. I watched her face change with every revelation, shock deepening into disbelief, then into something sharper. By the time I told her about the poker game, about my father's hidden $52,000, her lips had parted in stunned silence. She set her cup down slowly, her fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. "I cannot believe this," she whispered. "All these years they let you bleed yourself dry while they had money put aside." I nodded, staring at the table, ashamed that even saying it out loud still made me feel like a fool. Linda reached across the booth, resting her hand over mine. Her grip was firm, grounding. "You are not crazy. You are not imagining things. They used you, Lauren." Hearing it from her in that calm and certain voice, something in my chest cracked open. I hadn't realized how badly I needed someone else to name it, to confirm that I wasn't the ungrateful one or the selfish one. I blinked back, tears, my voice hoarse. I thought if I just kept helping, one day they would see me as more than a wallet. Her eyes softened, but her jaw was set. "They will never see you that way. People who choose to use someone rarely change." Silence stretched between us, filled with the clatter of plates and the faint hum of a jukebox. For the first time in years, I didn't feel entirely alone at the table. Linda leaned closer, her tone low but deliberate. "There's a family gathering in St. Louis next month. Everyone will be there, your parents, Megan, Eric. I'll be watching. And if I see what you're telling me with my own eyes, they will not be able to deny it." A mixture of fear and relief swirled in my stomach. She was offering me something I had never had before, an ally inside the circle I had been exiled from. I whispered, "You'd really do that?" Her fingers tightened around mine. "They need to be held accountable. And you deserve to be free of this." For a long moment, I just breathed, letting the weight of her words sink in. Free. The word felt foreign on my tongue, almost dangerous, but also intoxicating. The waitress came by with menus, but neither of us looked. My appetite had vanished, replaced with a steady fire in my chest. I said quietly, "I'm done being their safety net." Linda nodded once, her expression fierce in a way I rarely saw. "Then, let them fall." Her hand lingered on mine, warm and steady. "They have to pay the price for what they've done. You are not alone in this anymore." The diner faded around me, the voices, the clatter, even the smell of coffee. All I could focus on was the certainty in her voice. For the first time, the battle ahead did not feel like mine alone to fight. When I finally walked back out into the cold, the wind whipped at my face, but I didn't flinch. The city stretched before me, and for once the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. Linda's words echoed in my ears as I slid into my car, gripping the steering wheel with steady hands. They have to pay. And this time I wasn't going to be the one who paid for them. The week after my talk with Linda, I threw myself into work, believing if I kept my head down I could outrun the chaos. My small branding firm had just secured a contract with a regional restaurant chain that wanted a complete rebrand, everything from menus to storefront signage. It was the kind of project that could anchor my business for months. I spent late nights sketching concepts and building pitches, telling myself that focus would keep the noise away. Then out of nowhere the client emailed. They were pausing the project indefinitely. No explanation beyond a vague note about timing and concerns. My stomach twisted as I read it because I knew what it really meant. People rarely tell you the truth when they back out. I called the project lead, trying to keep my voice steady. She sounded uncomfortable, dodging specifics. Finally, she admitted that some chatter had reached their team. Questions about my reliability. Something about me causing a scene at a wedding. After the call ended, I sat at my desk in silence, my chest tight. I had worked too hard, built too much from nothing to have my own family unravel it with whispers. I opened Facebook, a place I usually avoided. Within seconds, I saw it. A post from one of Megan's friends, someone I barely knew but who had been at the wedding. The caption read, "Lauren lost it at her parents' reception. Total meltdown. Not stable enough to handle herself, let alone her work." Underneath were dozens of comments, some mocking, some gleeful, all spreading like oil on water. Worse still, someone had uploaded a video. My heart dropped as I clicked it. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. It showed me standing at the wedding the moment after Megan announced to the room that I didn't belong. But the video had been cut, so it looked like I had interrupted the toast, storming out in a rage. My voice had been clipped mid-sentence, leaving only the image of me walking away while gasps filled the room. I felt my throat close. On TikTok, the same video had already gone viral, stripped of context, and turned into a 30-second spectacle. Strangers wrote captions like, "When the family drama hits different," and "This is why we don't invite unstable people to weddings." I scrolled through the comments, each one a knife. I dropped my phone onto the desk and pressed my palms into my eyes until I saw stars. My family hadn't just humiliated me in private anymore, they were planting poison where I built my living. The next morning, one of my junior designers came into the office looking uneasy. She closed the door and said, "I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a video going around. People are talking." I forced a smile I didn't feel and told her I was aware. She hesitated, then added softly, "We know it's not true, but clients might not." After she left, I stared out the window at the traffic crawling down Main Street. My reflection in the glass looked hollow, smaller than I remembered. That evening, my phone lit up with a message from an old college friend. "Hey, is everything okay? Just saw some stuff online." I wanted to scream. I typed back quickly, "Just lies. Thanks for checking in." But the pit in my stomach only grew. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, the glow of my laptop the only thing in the room. My emails showed another client pushing back a meeting. No reason, just rescheduled indefinitely. I closed the screen and let the dark settle over me. They were not satisfied with draining my bank account or parading me as their safety net. Now they were trying to strip me of the only thing I had carved for myself, the work that kept me standing. For hours, I sat there listening to the faint sounds of the city drifting through the window. Anger simmered, slow and steady, coiling into something harder than grief. They had made me into their villain, their scapegoat, their entertainment. But as I stared at the dark screen in front of me, I felt the quiet certainty rise again. If they thought they could take my name, my career, and leave me with nothing, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. My eyes were still heavy, my body worn from the restless night before. I reached for it, expecting another client postponement or some half-hearted apology from someone who had shared the video. Instead, I saw an email notification. The sender's name made my heart jolt. Megan. For a second, I thought it was some cruel mistake, maybe a direct attack. But as I opened it, I realized she had CC'd me by accident. My breath caught as my eyes scanned the lines. She was writing to our relatives, giving them instructions on how to handle any questions about the wedding. She told them to make sure their stories matched, to describe me as unstable, unhinged, someone who had ruined the celebration with my outburst. I sat frozen, the words swimming on the screen. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was strategy. She was choreographing a campaign against me. Then I reached the last lines and the air in my lungs turned sharp. She had written, "Don't worry about Dad's little stash. That $52,000 is just a small retirement fund. Nobody needs to bring it up." My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles went white. The number hit me like a punch. 52,000. The money he had hidden while I paid bills, while I covered tuition, while I drained myself dry. I stood up, pacing my small apartment, my bare feet brushing against the rug. My heart pounded so hard I thought the neighbors might hear it through the walls. There it was, in her own words, undeniable proof of everything I had suspected. Not only had they used me, they had mocked me for being gullible enough to carry their weight. I sat back down at the table and forced my fingers to stop shaking. I read the email again slowly, this time committing each word to memory. Then I clicked forward, attaching Brittany's and Aunt Linda's addresses. My message was short. Look at this. It explains everything. My chest heaved as I hit send. Within minutes, Brittany replied with a string of capital letters. She couldn't believe it. She wrote that I had to save it somewhere safe, that this was bigger than family drama now. Linda's reply came not long after. Calm, measured, but heavy with weight. She said this was the kind of thing that unraveled people, that if I wanted, she would stand beside me when the time came. She ended with a single line that steadied my trembling hands. They cannot hide behind you anymore. I closed my laptop and sat back in the silence. The blinds swayed slightly from the draft, and the morning sun slipped through in broken streaks. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to them. I was holding something sharp, something they couldn't take back. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't look like the girl who had cowered at the reception, who had swallowed her shame in silence for years. I looked tired, yes, but also steadier. I thought of Megan sitting smug in her condo, Patricia clutching her pearls in staged tears, Richard with his poker games and secret savings, Eric pretending helplessness while demanding my help. I thought of how easily they had thrown me under the bus, how coordinated they had become when it came to keeping me in the role of provider and scapegoat. And now finally I had something to cut through their lies. The weight on my chest shifted. Not lighter, not yet, but different. More like armor than chains. I saved the email to a folder I labeled carefully, then backed it up to an external drive. I even printed a copy, sliding it into a folder in my desk drawer. If they wanted to paint me as unstable, I would answer with precision. When the clock ticked toward noon, I turned off my phone and sat at the table, letting the quiet settle. Outside, the city moved along in its usual rhythm. Inside, I knew I was holding the beginning of their end. The drive to St. Louis felt longer than it should have, every mile stretching out as if the highway itself wanted me to reconsider. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the weight of the folder on the passenger seat like a living thing. Aunt Linda had told me not to worry, that she would take care of it, but my stomach churned with unease. I knew how slippery my family could be when cornered. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of my cousin's house, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled into the cool evening air. The gathering looked warm, casual, almost innocent, but I knew what was about to unfold inside. I straightened my blazer, picked up the folder, and walked to the door. Linda greeted me at the entryway, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She squeezed my hand once before leading me into the living room where everyone was gathered. The Hayes family tree was spread across couches and armchairs, plates of food balanced on laps, the smell of barbecue thick in the air. Richard and Patricia sat together near the fireplace. Megan perched like a queen on the armrest, Eric talking too loudly about his job. I slipped into a chair near the corner, my heart hammering. Linda cleared her throat. The room quieted. She began slowly, her voice steady but carrying an edge that sliced through the chatter. She talked about family, about trust, about the way lies rot from the inside out. And then she said she had something everyone needed to hear. She opened her tablet, tapped the screen, and read aloud the email Megan had sent. The words filled the room like smoke. Every sentence, every calculated instruction about how to describe me, how to spin the story of the wedding, how to dismiss $52,000 as nothing more than a little retirement fund. Each syllable tightened the air until I could almost hear the collective breath of our relatives hitch in their throats. Patricia gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched tight. Megan shot up from the armrest, her face pale, then flushed with blotches of red. "That's out of context," she snapped. "You don't understand. It was just what one of our uncles cut in, his voice sharp. Just you telling us all to lie. Just you mocking the very person who has been paying your bills for years. Just your father hiding money while letting Lauren cover medical expenses." Murmurs rose around the room. Eyes that had always looked at me with polite distance now shifted with something else. Doubt. Anger. Recognition. Richard finally spoke, his voice low but firm. This is private, family business. It doesn't belong here. But another aunt leaned forward, her brow furrowed. It stopped being private when you took from Lauren while pretending you had nothing. 52,000 is not nothing, Richard. We all know what she's done for you. Patricia's tears started then, not the dramatic sobs she wielded at will, but the thin, quiet kind that slipped down her face when she had no script left to follow. Megan, though, wouldn't back down. She's exaggerating, Megan insisted, pointing at me with a trembling finger. She always has. She wants to look like some kind of martyr. Linda's voice cut through again, colder now. The email was yours, Megan. The words are yours. You can't spin your way out of this one. The room fell into a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. One by one, relatives turned their eyes toward Richard and Patricia, then to Megan. No one spoke in their defense. No one laughed it off. The space between them and the rest of the room grew wider with every second. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, letting the weight of it unfold without adding more. For years I had been the one trying to explain, trying to beg for someone to see what was happening. Now I didn't need to. The proof had spoken for itself. Finally, one of the cousins stood, muttering that he had lost his appetite. Others followed, drifting away from the fireplace and toward the kitchen or the door, creating a circle of distance that left my parents and siblings stranded in the center of the room. The chatter resumed, but not with them. Conversations sprouted elsewhere, careful and sharp, cutting them out like a rotten branch. Richard stared into the fire, his face carved in stone. Patricia dabbed at her cheeks, but no one offered her a tissue. Megan stood stiff, her arms folded, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. Eric tried to force a laugh, some attempt to lighten the tension, but it died instantly. I stayed quiet, my heart steady in my chest. The collapse wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the silence, the deliberate turning away, the knowledge that their performance had been seen through. The family name they clung to so tightly was slipping from their hands, not because of me, but because they had built it on lies and thought no one would ever question them. When I finally stepped out onto the porch, the night air was cool against my skin. Behind me, the voices hummed low and fractured. I knew nothing would be the same again, not for them, not for me. The cracks had spread too far. And for once, I wasn't the one holding the pieces together. Word spread quickly after that night in St. Louis. I didn't have to lift a finger. The silence of my relatives, the way they turned their backs on Richard, Patricia, Megan, and Eric, was enough to set things in motion. By the time I returned to Kansas City, the fallout had already begun. Megan was the first to feel it. Without my monthly payments covering her rent, the Plaza apartment she flaunted on social media became a noose tightening around her neck. I heard through a cousin that the landlord posted a notice on her door, a bright orange paper that clung to the glass for everyone in the building to see. Within weeks, she was gone, her clothes stuffed into trash bags and her furniture left on the curb. She moved into a rundown duplex on the edge of Independence, the kind of place where weeds grew high along the fences and the neighbors kept broken cars parked in their yards. For years she had looked down on me, her words dripping with disdain whenever she called me simple or boring. Now when she posted anything online, I noticed the silence in her comments. The friends who once clung to her stopped engaging. The spotlight she craved had dimmed. Richard and Patricia fared no better. The poker nights Richard loved so much became awkward, then non-existent. The men he used to brag with stopped inviting him after whispers about the 52,000 came out. It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal, the revelation that he had let his own daughter shoulder medical bills while he sat on a tidy sum. Their neighbors in Brookside, who had once waved cheerfully from their porches, grew distant. I drove past their house one evening and noticed how Patricia's flower beds had gone untended, the once bright yard now patchy and neglected. They had always cared about appearances, about what people thought of them. Now they had become the couple everyone whispered about, but no one visited. Without me covering their gaps, they had to dip into that hidden fund. At first, I imagine Richard told himself it was temporary, just a bridge until things calmed down. But bridges collapse when there's no ground on the other side. Month by month, the savings dwindled. Every poker game avoided, every social invitation ignored, every whispered conversation behind their backs chipped away at the illusion they had built. Patricia, who once cried to me on the phone about how hard it was to make ends meet, now cried alone in her kitchen because no one picked up her calls. Eric's unraveling was different. The weight of his family's facade fell hardest on his children. I got a message from a former coworker of his wife telling me how Pembroke Hill had called to say tuition hadn't been paid. His kids, who had always worn pressed uniforms and carried the newest backpacks, suddenly found themselves at a public school across town. I pictured their confusion the way children can't understand why something they once took for granted is gone. His wife, Melissa, was livid. The fights between them spilled out of their house loud enough for neighbors to hear. Eventually, Eric picked up night shifts driving deliveries, his car loaded with cardboard boxes instead of golf clubs. The proud stories he used to tell at family dinners about promotions and raises vanished. He avoided eye contact when anyone asked how work was going. For years, I had been the invisible thread holding their lives together, patching holes they didn't even acknowledge. Without me, those holes widened into craters. And watching it all unfold from a distance, I didn't feel the guilt they had always counted on. I felt something closer to clarity. One afternoon, I passed Megan by chance at a grocery store. She didn't see me at first. She was standing in the canned goods aisle, arguing quietly on the phone, her cart filled with store-brand items she once mocked me for buying. When her eyes finally met mine, she froze. The haughty tilt of her chin faltered, replaced by something I had never seen in her before: shame. She ended her call abruptly, mumbled a stiff hello, and pushed her cart away as fast as she could. I stood there for a moment, the sound of her cart wheels rattling down the aisle, and realized that for the first time she had nothing to say. Richard called once late at night. His voice was tired, rougher than I remembered. He didn't apologize, he didn't even try, he just asked if I could come by for dinner, said Patricia had been under the weather, that things had been hard. I told him I was busy. I didn't explain further. The silence on the line stretched out until he finally hung up. Eric never reached out directly, but I heard his name whispered in conversations at networking events, his reputation slipping after his wife vented publicly about their finances. He had always been so quick to judge me, so quick to call me cold or selfish when I hesitated to help. Now he was learning the cost of depending on a sister he had never respected. Karma didn't arrive with fireworks or police sirens. It came in overdue notices, in awkward silences, in social invitations that stopped arriving. It came in the slow unraveling of the stories they told about themselves, the ones that painted me as the background while they shone in the center. And the cruelest part, the part I knew cut deepest for them, was that everyone else could see it too. I didn't dance in the wreckage. I didn't gloat. I simply lived. I woke up in my own apartment in Midtown, drank my coffee, answered emails, worked on projects that still came my way despite their efforts. Every ordinary moment felt like proof that I had survived them, that I didn't need their approval or their permission to keep going. The distance between us grew wider each day, not because I built walls, but because they dug their own graves. And as I watched from afar, I realized I no longer feared their collapse. It wasn't my burden to carry. It never had been. By January, the air in Kansas City carried that dry chill that made every breath feel sharp, but for the first time in years, winter did not weigh me down. I had signed the lease on a loft tucked into the Crossroads Arts District, a space smaller than the Midtown apartment, but brighter, roar alive with possibility. Exposed brick lined the walls, tall windows looked out onto streets, painted with murals, and each evening the faint hum of jazz drifted from the bars below. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine, paid with money I earned without strings or shame. Moving in felt like peeling off the last layer of a skin that no longer fit. I stacked my boxes against the wall, set down the sketchbooks that had followed me through every chapter of my life, and breathed in the scent of sawdust and old paint. The loft carried the history of artists who had come before me, their echoes etched into the scuffed wooden floors. For once I felt like I belonged in a story bigger than the one my family had tried to trap me in. It didn't take long before I found myself drawn into the neighborhood rhythm. A week after moving in, I stopped into a cafe on Southwest Boulevard, its walls crowded with canvases from local painters. Behind the counter was Sophie, a photographer with sharp eyes and a messy bun that looked as if it had been tied in the middle of a shoot. She handed me my coffee and asked if I was new to the area. When I said yes, she smiled and said she knew. She told me Crossroads had a way of noticing fresh faces. By the end of that conversation, she had invited me to an open studio night. I almost said no. Years of being used had trained me to keep my distance, to expect that every invitation carried a cost. But something in Sophie's voice felt genuine, so I went. The studio was a renovated warehouse, its walls lined with photographs, sculptures, and sketches. People moved easily from one piece to another, drinks in hand, conversations bubbling like water on the stove. I stood in the corner at first watching until Sophie pulled me into her circle of friends. They were painters, designers, sculptors, photographers. Not one of them asked me what I could give them. They asked about my work, my process, what colors I liked best in winter light. For the first time, I felt seen, not as a bank account but as an artist. Their curiosity was not hunger. It was respect. Days became weeks and the loft slowly transformed. Canvases leaned against the brick walls, sticky notes cluttered the desk where I mapped out branding projects, and the kitchen table was forever half covered in swatches of paper and ink samples. I woke each morning to sunlight spilling through the tall windows and the sound of the city waking up around me. My work picked up again, not out of pity or obligation, but because clients found me drawn to the clarity of my designs. They didn't care about family politics or social gossip. They cared about the work. One afternoon in March, I sat at the long wooden table in my loft reviewing a proposal for a new restaurant in the Crossroads district. The client wanted a brand identity that felt both raw and refined, something that spoke to the grit of the neighborhood but carried elegance for fine dining. As I sketched, I realized how natural it felt, how my ideas flowed without the weight of doubt pressing down on me. The whispers my family had spread online had faded. The people who mattered didn't listen to gossip, they listened to vision. Sophie stopped by later that day with her camera slung over her shoulder. She looked around at the clutter of my workspace and laughed, saying it looked like I had finally found the right kind of mess. She asked if I wanted to join her for a photo walk through the alleys at sunset. I almost declined, deadlines looming, but I followed her instead. As we wandered through streets lit orange and pink, she snapped photos while I noticed textures I had never seen before: peeling paint, broken windows, shadows stretching long. Inspiration was everywhere, and for once I wasn't too tired to notice it. The friendships deepened. Late nights in the district turned into shared dinners, critiques of each other's work plans for future collaborations. I no longer felt the sharp edges of loneliness I had carried for years. I had not replaced my family, but I had found a community that thrived on creating instead of consuming. One evening in early spring, I stood in the middle of my loft, hammer in hand, about to hang a new piece on the wall. It was a design I had poured myself into, a bold composition of lines and light that felt like a map of where I had been and where I was going. As I stepped back and watched the last rays of daylight filter through the window, the piece glowed against the brick. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. Not just from them, but from the version of myself who had once believed that love had to be purchased, that belonging had to be earned through sacrifice. Here, surrounded by the hum of the city and the quiet of my own space, I was no longer a provider, no longer a victim. I was simply me. The light caught on the glass of the frame, scattering across the room, and I stood still, letting it wash over me. The loft was small, imperfect, but it was enough. It was mine. Night settled over the Crossroads, and the city hummed like a distant chorus. I sat on the floor with my back against the brick, knees drawn up, a mug of tea cooling between my hands. The framed piece on the wall caught what little light remained, lines and shapes I had made when I finally trusted myself again. I watched it glow and fade, and I let my mind walk back through the last year like a street I knew by heart. I remembered the reception hall and the click of my heels on polished wood. I remembered the cold air outside and how it felt like oxygen after weeks of holding my breath. I remembered the silence of my apartment when they left, the thud in my chest that sounded like a door closing and opening at the same time. The pieces fell in order without effort. The hidden savings, the email, the way the room shifted in St. Louis when the truth sat in the middle of it where everyone could see. The fallout came next. Eviction notices. Cancelled poker nights. A name that no one wanted to defend anymore. I did not pretend it was all triumph. There were nights when old habits reached for me. I would hear a siren and think of my father's knee surgery and the way I signed checks faster than I signed my own lease. I would pass a schoolyard and think of the semesters I covered the little uniforms I paid for, and a part of me would ache. Love and anger do not cancel each other out. They sit side by side and learn to share a table. On the coffee table lay a thin folder with papers I used to avoid. Credit reports. A spreadsheet with every payment I had made for them, not as a ledger to be thrown in anyone's face, but as proof for myself that I had not imagined any of it. I ran a fingertip down the list and then closed the folder. I did not need it tonight. The numbers no longer defined me. My phone buzzed. A text from Brittany. Open studio night on Friday. You coming? I smiled before I even typed a reply. I told her I would be there. I set the phone face down and let the quiet return softer than it used to be, almost kind. In the morning I walked to the corner cafe where Sophie liked to edit her photos. The barista knew my order now. I sat by the window and answered emails from 2 new clients who had found me through word of mouth. No mention of gossip. Only portfolios and timelines and colors that felt like cedar and smoke. Work had become steady again, not because I shouted above the noise, but because the work spoke for itself. On my way out, I saw a familiar car crawl by on the street, dented along the rear fender, the driver hunched over the wheel. Eric. He did not see me through the glass. For a moment, I studied his face harder than I remembered older too. I felt the tug I used to feel, that rush to solve and soften and save. It passed like a cloud crossing the sun. He would learn to stand up like the rest of us. Maybe he already had. Later that week, Aunt Linda called. We did not talk long. She told me the family was quiet these days. Fewer group photos online. Fewer invitations. She said people had stopped pretending not to notice things. She did not use the word justice. She did not need to. I thanked her for believing me when I could barely believe myself. We hung up with easy goodbyes that did not strain. I walked home through the narrow streets of the district, past loading docks and brick walls tattooed with paint. Inside the loft, I pulled a new print from the drying rack and held it against the wall. The composition tilted to the left, almost falling, then caught itself. It looked like me in the best way. Not perfect, balanced anyway. There were still small aches that visited in quiet moments. The smell of a roast would remind me of Sunday dinners at my parents' house when we felt like a family that could hold. Old photos in a shoebox could pull me under for an hour. I let the feelings come and go. I did not punish them or feed them. I did not call anyone to ask if I was right to feel them. I sat with them until they thinned into air. One afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox with my mother's handwriting on it. No return address. I carried it upstairs and set it on the counter. I made coffee. I watered the plant that somehow survived my irregular attention. Only then did I open it. Inside was a short note in a shaky hand that said she hoped I was well. No apology, no request, no mention of money. For a moment I waited for the old urgency to rise. It did not. I folded the note and slid it into a drawer with the others that marked thresholds in my life. It could sit there without deciding anything for me. Sophie came by that evening with a stack of prints. We spread them on the floor and argued about which ones belonged in the show next month. She picked one of mine up and turned it in her hands like a stone she liked the weight of. She said it felt like clarity. I laughed and told her it had cost me years. She nodded and said sometimes that is the price. Time moved in ordinary ways again. Tuesdays felt like Tuesdays. Weekends carried their own light. I cooked more. I slept through the night. I sent an email to a nonprofit that worked with young artists in public schools and offered to run a workshop on branding for their student market. They wrote back with way too many exclamation points and a thank you that made me grin in spite of myself. The idea of standing in a room and talking about color and voice and shape did not make me small. It made me excited. On the day the first warm wind of spring blew in from the south, I opened the windows and let it carry the loft's dust into the corners. I rolled the rug back and laid out craft paper on the floor, a ritual before a big push. I mixed ink until it looked like burnt honey, and I worked until the light faded into a lavender haze. When I straightened up, my back ached in the best way. The kind of ache that says you built something. I thought then of that younger version of me, the one who kept a wallet like a first aid kit and measured her worth in what she could pay for. I wanted to tell her she had always been enough. That love could not be purchased. That family is not supposed to require a receipt. I wanted to tell her she would walk out of a room that tried to erase her and step into a life that did not. The city settled outside, streetlights blinking awake, tires shushing over damp pavement. I washed my hands at the sink and watched the ink swirl away. The framed piece on the wall caught the last band of light and glowed again. I stood there a long time, letting my shoulders drop, letting my breath lengthen. The past did not vanish. It took its seat and learned its place. I could carry it without letting it steer. If you are listening and you recognize pieces of your own story in mine, I hope you hear this clearly. Cutting ties with people who harm you is not betrayal. It is a vote for your life. It is how you make room for the right work and the right friends and the quiet that does not hurt. If something in these chapters helped you feel less alone, tell me where you are listening from and what part hit home. Share your story in the comments so someone else can find their way out. If you want to hear more stories about finding a spine where you once had a bruise, stay with me and subscribe. There is more to build when we refuse to be the ones holding the pieces together for people who break us.